Hello and welcome everyone to our weekly session, Bitcoin Optech newsletter titled Latest in Bitcoin Tech, where we cover the weekly Bitcoin Optech newsletter. And this week we will go through newsletter number 318, published on 30th of August 2024. Like every week, we commence with the news section. This week's news section has just one article that mentions that there is now a new Bitcoin mining development mailing list. For those of you who are intrigued to uh, stay in touch with the latest developments that unfold in the world of Bitcoin mining, can subscribe to this mailing list. We already have a Bitcoin development mailing list. Okay, that is for developers, and now we have a mining development list, which is specific to the latest protocols, the latest developments, tools being built in the world of Bitcoin mining. And there is no article as such, like that. There is no specific protocol that's been covered. The news article just mentions that a new Bitcoin mining development mailing list has been dropped. So we'll go to the mailing list and we'll pick up probably one of the posts in the mailing list and go through it, so that those who want to subscribe to the mailing list can understand what kind of contents are covered in the mailing list. Then we have our weekly special Q&A from Bitcoin Stack Exchange. We have 7 questions. Let us see how many we will be able to cover. So, and then we have the release and release candidates and the code and documentation changes. Let's see how much of it will we be able to cover. So let's go through the preface of the newsletter first. This week's newsletter announces a new mailing list to discuss Bitcoin mining. Also included are our regular sections summarizing popular questions and answers from the Bitcoin Stack Exchange, announcements of new releases and release candidates, and descriptions of recent changes to popular Bitcoin infrastructure. The first news article is new Bitcoin mining development mailing list. Jay Bedict announced a new mailing list to discuss emerging Bitcoin mining technology updates as well as the impacts of Bitcoin related software or protocol changes on mining. Mark Moch O'Hart posted to the list to ask whether the time warp fix deployed on testnet 4 could lead to miners creating invalid blocks if the same fix was deployed to mainnet, such as part of a cleanup soft fork. Mike Smith referred list readers to a thread on the Bitcoin dev mailing list and Oblivious shares. See newsletter 315. So we will go to this announcement. Right. This is the announcement. Let us see where are the posts. Can we look at the posts? Yeah, this is one of the posts. And this is related. This is, I think, the first post in the mailing list, like the Genesis post. And it is about time warp attack. And we've talked about time warp attack in detail. So let us cover what this post is. Okay, this post is by Moch or Mark O'Hart. What does this post says? Hey y'all, I want to pick your brain and make you. Let me zoom in. I think the font is very small. I want to pick your brain and make you aware regarding the new timestamp restriction included in the testnet 4 consensus rules. Testnet 4 requires that the timestamp of the first block of a difficulty period does not precede the timestamp of the last block of the prior difficulty period by more than 10 minutes. We covered this in detail in the last to last Optech newsletter. I think it was 316, if I'm not wrong, where we talked about a time warp attack, and we talked about how testnet 4 mitigates that time warp attack. That was by ensuring that the first block in a difficulty adjustment period cannot have a timestamp less than 600 seconds or 10 minutes as compared to the timestamp of the last block in the previous difficulty adjustment period. Okay, so if the final block in a difficulty adjustment period, that is block number 2016, has time n, then block 2017, which is the first block of the subsequent difficulty adjustment period, cannot be less than n minus 600 seconds. Okay, so we have figured out different types of time warp attacks. You know how a miner with a considerable amount of hash power can manipulate the timestamps and put a timestamp in past, way in past, 1 week in past, 2 week in past, to deceive the difficulty adjustment algorithm and thereby reduce the difficulty of mining blocks. And how do we mitigate that? We mitigate that by ensuring that the first block in a difficulty adjustment time epoch has a timestamp no less than 600 seconds as compared to the last block as compared to the timestamp of the last block in the previous difficulty adjustment period. Okay, that's what he says. To put it differently, time cannot go back more than 600 seconds between difficulty periods, or formally for each block height B, where this is the same expressed in equation. The rule is part of the consensus change put forth for the Great Consensus Cleanup Proposal and helps prevent the jump of difficulty periods in time versus the start of the subsequent difficulty period start time necessary for the classic time of attack. Now, it's also important for us to note that this change is only implemented on the testnet, right? This change we've implemented, it's only on testnet 4, it's not on the mainnet. The same proposal has been made for the main net, okay? And there is a soft fork proposal known as the Great Consensus Cleanup Proposal. I cannot remember who proposed this. If somebody remembers, please mention the name. It's either Greg Maxwell or Matt Corello. It's one of the two. I believe it's Greg Maxwell. I'm not very sure. One of the two. Okay. So this proposal is also being made for the mainnet. Uh, all right. I'm concerned that if this rule were eventually introduced in mainnet, it might cause a miner to build an invalid block due to them assigning the current time to their block template after someone time stamped the last block of a difficulty period into the future by more than 10 minutes. Okay. Now, by now, we know we've talked about this on various occasions in our Monday sessions that a Bitcoin, a valid Bitcoin block must have a valid timestamp. What defines the validity of a timestamp? What timestamp can be defined as a valid timestamp, right? There is a range. There is a lower bound and there is an upper bound. There's a lower bound of time. There's an upper bound of time. So the timestamp of the block needs to fall between that lower bound and that upper bound for that block to be valid and for the timestamp to be valid. What's the lower bound? We've discussed it on various occasions. It's the mean time passed of the past 11 blocks. What's the upper bound? It's current time, your local system's time, your node's time plus 2 hours. Okay. So your timestamp cannot be lesser than the median time pass of the previous 11 blocks. That is the timestamp of the last sixth block. And it cannot be greater than 2 hours in the future. Okay. So what if a miner mines a block and puts a timestamp which is 2 hours in the future? Okay. This is absolutely valid. We just now discussed and agreed that a timestamp which is up to 2 hours in the future is valid. So a miner mines a block. Okay, miner mines the last block of a difficulty adjustment period. Okay, let's say block number 2016 and puts the timestamp of 2 hours in the future. All right, and then in the first block of the subsequent difficulty adjustment algorithm, another miner mines the block and puts the current time. Okay, puts the current time, which means that the timestamp of the first block in the difficulty adjustment algorithm period 2017 in our example will have a timestamp of approximately 1 hour 50 minutes in the past, right? Because block number 2016 had a timestamp of 2 hours in the future, which is valid. And now block number 2017 has the actual timestamp, which probably would be 10 minutes after 2016, which means it would be 1 hour 15 minutes before the last block which has been mined, okay? Which means as per this rule, that block will be invalid, okay? Because we have just now set up a new rule on testnet 4, which if applied on the mainnet would ensure that a block, first block in a difficulty adjustment algorithm, if its timestamp is more than 10 minutes in the past of the last block in the previous difficulty adjustment algorithm, then that block will be considered invalid. So if a miner mines the final block in a difficulty adjustment algorithm period and puts a timestamp of 2 hours in the future, and then the next miner comes and he mines the first block in the subsequent difficulty adjustment algorithm and he puts the current time. Okay. Both the blocks are valid per se. Okay. What will happen is that this first block in the subsequent difficulty adjustment algorithm, subsequent difficulty adjustment time period will be invalid because now it has a timestamp of approximately 1 hour 15 minutes in the past. All right. So if we apply this rule on the mainnet, there is a possibility that a miner might find a valid block, put a current timestamp, and despite that, his block will be rendered invalid just because the previous miner put a timestamp of 2 hours in the future. So up till now, it's clear, I hope, what the problem is. If we apply this rule on the mainnet, I hope everybody understood what the problem is and how applying this rule on the mainnet would invalidate a valid block of the first valid block of a difficulty adjustment period. Any questions pertaining that? All right. If no questions, then let's proceed. So what is the mitigation? I think he proposes the mitigation here. To provide, thanks for sharing. That's good to hear. To provide a bit more context here, the upcoming Bitcoin Core 28.0 release with chip support for testnet 4 will also include a mitigation to the issue I described. In the case that the last block in a difficulty period was stamped into the future, the response to a get block template call for the first block in the subsequent difficulty period would automatically raise the timestamp of the block template to adhere to the 10-minute constraint. Okay. So what will happen is that if the last block in a difficulty adjustment period has a timestamp of 2 hours in the future, okay, when the miner creates the first block of the subsequent difficulty adjustment algorithm, okay, automatically the software is functioned or programmed in a manner that automatically the timestamp that is put in the first block of the subsequent difficulty adjustment period will adhere to this rule. Okay. So if the timestamp that the miner has entered is less than is greater than 10 minutes, uh, is less than 10 minutes before the timestamp that has been put in the last block of the previous difficulty adjustment algorithm, the software will adjust the timestamp of the first block of the difficulty adjustment period to ensure that it is not more than 600 seconds in the past. Okay, so this is the mitigation. What the problem is? The problem is that if we put this rule on mainnet, okay, if we say that first block in a difficulty adjustment period can only be valid if its timestamp is no less than 600 seconds as compared to the last block in the previous difficulty adjustment algorithm, this might cause a problem on the mainnet. Why? Because on the mainnet, it's possible for a block to have a timestamp 2 hours in the future. So if a miner mines the final block of a difficulty adjustment period and puts a timestamp of 2 hours in the future, and then the next miner comes and he mines the first block in the subsequent difficulty adjustment period and he puts the current time, it would mean that the first block's current time or the legitimate time, even though it's the correct time, it will be 1 or 50 minutes in the past, and thus the miner's work will be rendered null and void and the block would be invalidated. So to counter that, changes have been made in Bitcoin Core 28.0 such that when a miner mines the final block in a difficulty adjustment period and puts a timestamp 2 hours in the future, the next block, when the miner triggers this RPC get block template for the next block, automatically the timestamp will be adjusted in such a manner that it adheres with the 10-minute constraint. The timestamp will not be in the past greater than 600 seconds so that the miner's work is not rendered null and void and a valid block is not invalidated. That is the problem, and that is the solution. That is the first mail in the Bitcoin Dev mining mailing list. Any questions pertaining this? All right, so we are done with the news articles. We have, yeah, we have 7 Bitcoin Stack Exchange questions and answers. If anybody would like to take a shot at any of them or would like to share anything or any insights on any specific question, feel free to interrupt me and talk about it. Anyone?
Yeah, I can talk about the second one. Did BIP 141 eliminate all TXID malleability issues?
Okay, I'll give some background about this. Okay, before you start talking about it. So last week, me and a friend of mine and a Bitcoin core developer were having a conversation about this. Okay, whether SegWit fixed transaction malleability or whether BIP62 had already fixed transaction malleability, had already proposed to fix transaction malleability before BIP 141. And PR 6769, if anybody gets time, this is a PR that was opened by Greg Maxwell. Uh, Fixed transaction malleability before SegWit, right? SegWit happened in 2017. This PR was opened in 2015 by Greg Maxwell. When I personally went through this PR, I believe that this PR mitigates transaction malleability. So we were having a discussion, and one of my friend went and asked this question. Okay, so I was partly right, partly wrong. This PR does mitigate transaction malleability, but there are 9 known ways in which a TXID can be malleated. This PR fix one of them. It fixed one of them, not the other 8. The other 8 were proposed by BIP 662, but BIP 62 fixes transaction malleability uh, without segregating the witness data. Okay, so all forms of transaction malleability, there are 9 different ways in which a transaction ID can be malleated. Okay, all 9 of them come from the script sig. All 9 of them are come into existence by manipulating the script sig. Okay, what BIP62 does is that what BIP62 proposes is that we will not separate the script sig from the transaction. We will keep the script sig in the transaction, and while keeping the script sig in the transaction, we will close all avenues that can be used to malleate the TX ID. What BIP 141 on SegWit does is just it removes the source of malleability. Okay, so the developer said that hey, it's a script sig which is the cause of all malleability. Instead of finding avenues to mitigate those malleabilities, let's just strip the SIP of the transaction, keep it separate. Okay, so that's the difference between BIP 62 and BIP 141. Okay, both of these BIPs, if y'all get time, go through them. Both of these BIPs propose mitigations for transaction ID malleability. What BIP 62 does is that it keeps the structure of the transaction intact. It does not separate, it does not split the script sig, and it proposes avenues to mitigate transaction ID malleability. What BIP 141 does is that it says, hey, all the problem is being caused by the script sig. The script sig is the source of transaction ID malleability. Let's just strip it off the transaction. It's not a part of the transaction structure anymore, so nobody can manipulate it to change the TX ID. That's the primary difference between BIP 62 and BIP 141. So the context is that this question was asked by one of my friends, and this is the consequence of our discussion that three of us had last week. So yeah, that is the context to it. It's 13 days ago, 2 weeks ago. All right. Yeah, Bala. Uh, question is, did SegWit BIP 141 eliminate all TXID malleability issues listed in BIP 62?
Yeah. Like as Faisal mentioned, like there are nine sources of transaction malleability that are listed in BIP 62. So let's just go over them and then figure out how BIP 141 fixes them. So the first source is non-DER encoded ECDSA signatures. So ECDSA is the signing algorithm. So once you sign your
Uh,
transactions.
so- yeah, sorry to interrupt, Bala. What I suggest is that, okay, because in the answer they've also covered only three. If you cover all nine, this question will take the entire session. So I would appreciate if you mention just two or three so that the readers get a hint of it, and then we can go to how BIP 141 fixes, because the fix is same for all the nine. So we can discuss one, two, or three as per your choice, and then we can go to the mitigation.
Okay, so yeah, one of the sources of malleability is non-DER ECDSA signatures. So ECDSA is the signing algorithm that Bitcoin uses. So and now Schnorr has come up. So as after you sign your transaction with ECDSA algorithm, you get the signature. But in order to standardize it, there is something called DER encoding. So it is distinguished encoding rules, nothing but. So it standardizes the signatures across transactions. So there is the problem is uh, the client uses OpenSSL to validate these signatures. So OpenSSL has its within itself is the validation algorithm, and within itself it has some leniency with respect to how strictly your signatures are encoded in the DER format. So it will pass a signature to be valid even if it's not strictly encoded in the DER format. Anyway, your signature is valid because you signed it with your private key. So the signature is valid except that it's not in the DER format. So because the Bitcoin client core uses OpenSSL, it can pass non-DER encoded signatures. So what is the issue with this? Uh, you might sign a transaction with or without DR encoded signatures because your signature was a part of your TXID computation process. Even though the signature is the same, because it's one is DR encoded and one is DR non DR encoded, it will cause change in the TXID. So while you compute for everything being the same, except that one of your in one case your signature is DR encoded, and in the other case it's not DR encoded, the TX ID will change. So that is a problem, and that's how malleability occurs in your transaction. So this was fixed because, as Faisal mentioned, no longer are signatures a part of the TX computation process after SegWit. So automatically, this malleability gets fixed with the introduction of SegWit. And even before that, there is a sort of not a consensus, but policy kind of thing that all wallets that sign should sort of strictly enforce DER format. So that has been there, but there is no way to enforce it, and therefore SegWit, as SegWit brought the signature out of your TXID computation, this problem has gone away. So that is one. Second, another thing is that the another source is that there are like within your script sig, there can be superfluous operations. For example, if you want to use op0, you can directly use op0, but you can also achieve what op0 would achieve on your script by using two or three other opcodes. So that is called as superfluous operation. So what happens is that because script sigs were part of the TXID computation, if you replace your script sig with some superfluous operation, even though the execution of the script and the result remains the same, the because the script changes, your TXID will change, and that's how malleability could occur. And this was also fixed just because script sigs were no more part of the are no more part of the transaction ID computation process. So that is another. Um, Another thing is that um, this sig hash type. So if you are using a sig hash all, that means you are signing for all parts of the transaction, including the inputs and outputs. So once you have signed it, signed it, and there is no other changes in any part of the transaction, then the TXID remains the same. If for any reasons your transaction uses other SIG hash types like SIG hash none or SIG hash single, SIG hash none is used when you sign all the inputs but not the outputs. Like the outputs are not signed and it can change. So in that case, obviously pre-SegWit, if the output is changed, the TXID changes. Similarly, in the case of SIG hash single, you'll typically sign the input and one of the output, and the rest of the outputs can be changed. So that in that case also pre-SegWit, if any one of the output is changed, then the TXID changes. So using SIG hash none and SIG hash single were a source of malleability, and they were not a recommended practice, and they had to be used extremely carefully because if there are child transactions which are based on these transactions, then any malleability in the part of the parent transaction will invalidate the child transactions. So this problem was there pre-SegWit. Now because SegWit has removed signature out of TXID computation, now this opens the potential of other SIG hash types. So yeah, that's a three. That's one of the three. A part of the three sources of malleability, and just because SegWit pushed the signature part out of the transaction ID calculation, most of the problems have been resolved.
Right, great, great. Thanks a lot for the detailed answer, Bala. Thank you. Uh, all right. So from my end also, I'll try and summarize. So the question is, did SegWit? Okay, so basically BIP 141 is the SegWit BIP. It's the BIP that was proposed to implement SegWit on Bitcoin. What's SegWit? As the name suggests, it segregates the witness. Okay, what's the witness? The witness is your public key and your digital signature, right? As in the real world, what's a witness, right? The witness is the witness testifies to the authenticity of something, right? So your witness in the Bitcoin transaction testifies, it proves that you are authenticated to sign a to spend a transaction. Okay, so you need your witness is the combination of the couple of your public key and your digital signature. Okay, so you have a private key. Using that private key, you create a digital signature to sign the transaction, and using that same private key, you create a public key, and then you share the public key and the digital signature, using which, without sharing a private key, using which it can be proved that you possess access to the private key which was used to create this digital signature and this public key. Okay, so what's a witness in Bitcoin? The witness is the combination of your public key and your digital signature. Why do we call this SegWit? Because earlier, your public key and your digital signature were included in the transaction itself, meaning they were used to compute the transaction ID, right? How do you create the transaction ID of a transaction? You hash the transaction. Okay, you take the transaction, you hash it. When you hash it, you double hash it, you get the TX ID. Okay, you take a Bitcoin transaction, you double hash it using SHA-256 algorithm, and the output, the hexadecimal output, is a TX ID of the transaction. Okay, so earlier, because your witness, your public key, and your digital signature are a part of a script sig. Okay, so in a Bitcoin transaction, we have a locking script and we have an unlocking script. The locking script is also known as script pub key, and the unlocking script is also known as the script sig. Okay, what does the unlocking script or the script sig have? It has the public key and the digital signature. Okay, and all of this, the locking script and the unlocking script, all of these things, the input, the output, the locking script, the unlocking script, all of this was a part of a transaction, and the entire transaction was hashed to create the TX ID. Okay. Now the issue was that there are certain ways in which you can manipulate data in the script sig. You can manipulate the digital signature to ensure that the same transaction can have two TX IDs. Okay. So I take the digital signature, which is a part of the transaction. I hash the transaction, I create a TX ID. Now I can make some changes to the digital signature. What are those changes? We won't be able to discuss with it. It's not in the scope of this session. You can go and read. There are 9 ways, 9 known and popular ways in which you can do that, which I mentioned in 62. Okay, there are 9 ways in which you can change the digital signature, and despite changes made to the digital signature, that digital signature will still be valid. Okay, so one single transaction can have two valid digital signatures. When they have two valid digital signatures, it means they can have two takes IDs, right? Because we are taking the digital signature, which is a part of which is the part of the unlocking script or the script sig, right? And we are hashing the transaction including the digital signature. Okay, so if I can have two valid digital signatures, then I will have two different hashes, which means I will have two different TX IDs. So before SegWit, it was possible for one Bitcoin transaction to have two valid digital signatures. And when one transaction has two valid digital signatures, it can have two valid TX IDs, which is a huge cause of concern. So I can create a transaction, sign it, give it to Alice. I can take the same transaction, make some changes to the script sig, create another digital signature, which is also valid, and sign the same transaction with a different TX ID and give it to Bob. So I have given the same transaction with the same inputs, but different TX IDs, one to Bob and one to Alice. Now the nodes will not recognize it, right? Because if I broadcast the same a transaction with the same TX ID twice, then the nodes will reject it. Okay, but now because the TX IDs are different, the nodes will keep on relaying, right? So I can give the same transaction to Alice and the same transaction to Bob with two different TX IDs, and fool one of them, right? Because only one is going to get confirmed eventually. Okay, so one gets confirmed and the other person gets duped. This is known as TX ID malleability. Okay, so when one transaction can have two TX IDs, that is known as transaction ID malleability, and the cause of it is that it is possible for you to manipulate digital signatures in a manner that one transaction can have two different digital signatures. And now digital signatures, since they are a part of the script sig or the unlocking script or the input script, what was decided is that we strip off the input script or the script sig from the transaction itself. So now when you compute the TX ID, you take everything into consideration. You take the input into the consideration, you take the output in the consideration, you take the locking script, which is known as script pub key into consideration, and you hash all of that and you create a TX ID, but you don't take the script sig or the the unlocking script, or also known as the witness data. You don't take that into consideration. That you have separately, and that is known as WTX ID. Okay, so initially a Bitcoin transaction used to have only a TX ID. After SegWit, a Bitcoin transaction has a TX ID as well as a WTX ID. So wherever you see WTX ID, know that it's a SegWit transaction. WTX ID is nothing but the hash of your witness data, the hash of your public key and your digital signature. And TX ID is the hash of everything excluding the public key and the digital signature in a transaction. Okay, that is what this is. So now that we've separated, or we've split the digital signature from computing the TX ID, it is not possible for anybody to manipulate the digital signature and create another TX ID, right? Because now we don't take the digital signature into account while computing the TX ID. That was fixed by uh, SegWit. Okay. Now, before SegWit, there was another BIP proposed known as BIP 62. That BIP proposed that we should not separate the digital signature in computing the TX ID, but we should find out all the ways in which a digital signature can be manipulated and close those avenues. Okay, that's what BIP 62 proposed. But then BIP 141 came and said, hey, we'll just strip it off. Okay, instead of mitigating each and every avenue of transaction malleability that can be caused by manipulating the digital signatures, we just remove the digital signatures and the public key and keep it separately. We'll not use it for computing the TX ID. So yeah, this is what the question was, like, what is it that SegWit does that this BIP did not do? So the answer is that this BIP tried to solve transaction ID malleability by closing all of the avenues of transaction ID malleability, uh, while including the digital signature as a part of a transaction in computing TX ID. Then SegWit came along and proposed that we just strip the digital signature. Okay, and if you want, you can go through this answer. Three examples are given. Three examples or three ways through which a digital signature can be manipulated. Three manipulations that can be performed, which can ensure that one single pre-SegWit transaction can have two valid digital signatures, and how they were combated by BIP 62. Okay, BIP 62. And one of them is also PR 6769, right? The digital signature contains of two components. One is R and one is S. Okay, and it is possible to compute two different values of S, and both of which will be, okay, this is how your digital signature looks like, R and S. Okay, and there can be two valid values of S. Okay, so I can create a digital signature with one value of S and give it to Alice. I can create another digital signature with another value of S and give it to Bob. So what this PR suggests is that we will only use the low S. Okay, so there are two possible values of S. One is the higher value, one is the lower value. This PR opened by Greg Maxwell suggested that we will make only the low value standard. So if somebody tries to uh, broadcast a transaction with low value and then broadcast the same transaction with a high value, the nodes will not relay the transaction with high value. So this is one of the ways out of those nine in which a transaction ID could have been malleated before SegWit. This PR fixes that one specifically. BIP 62 fixes all nine, while not splitting the script sig or the witness data from the transaction. Then comes BIP 141. It just splits off the source of all the quote unquote problem. It just uh, splits the entire digital signature from computing the TX ID. So no matter what anybody does to the digital signature, the TX ID will not change. So these are like the three stages you can say of how SegWit was mitigated. Any questions? Any suggestions? Any thoughts? Anything anybody would like to say before we move on to the next question? Somebody has posted something. Consensus cleanup. Yeah, who was it? I don't want to open. Would you like to type coding P? Or do you know who is the author? Who's the author of this? Let me see. It's either Matt Corello or it's Greg Maxwell. I'll be surprised if it's any third person. Yes, it's Matt Corello. Yes, what do I get? Yeah, it's Matt Corello. My memory did not ditch me. Yeah, Matt. Thanks. All right, we will go to the. By the way, you should go through it. Whoever, especially people who are inclined towards Bitcoin Core, go through the great consensus cleanup. It's known as the great consensus cleanup. It performs multiple changes through one single soft fork. So yeah, go through it. Whoever wants to. Okay, so we covered the second question first. Now we go to the first question. Okay. Can a BIP 152 compact block be sent before validation by a node that doesn't know all transactions? We've talked about compact blocks in detail in the preceding sessions. Okay, not recently, but some time ago. My laptop is lagging, guys, so kindly bear with me. Okay, so the question is, can a BIP 152 compact block be sent before validation by a node that doesn't know all transactions? Let us in brief first understand what a compact block is. We'll try and cover this up in 5 to 7 minutes so that at least we can cover 4 or 5 questions. So you can go through BIP 152 if you want to understand what compact block is. So before BIP 152, what used to happen is that basically we know, all of us here by now know that nodes gossip data on the network, right? It's a gossip protocol. Bitcoin is a gossip protocol. All the nodes on the network keep on gossiping information with each other. Primarily three pieces of information the nodes gossip. The first is the transaction. Okay, so whenever a node sees a transaction, it validates that transaction and it gossips it with its other peers, right? So that node will validate the transaction and send it to the other peers. And the second thing is blocks. So whenever a node sees a new block, the node will validate that block and then that node will share that block with its other peers. And the third is IP addresses. So whenever a node has an IP address, it will share that IP address with its peers. Okay, so transactions, blocks, and IP addresses are the three primary pieces of information that nodes gossip on the network. Now, there are thousands of nodes on the network. Okay, like recently, the recent data that I had a few years ago, a couple of years ago, not a long time ago, that there are more than 10,000 public nodes. There are more than 10,000 public Bitcoin nodes. And on an average, 144 blocks are mined every single day. So if we assume that a block is worth 1 MB, that's 144 MB of data every single day that a node has to relay. And if there are 10,000 nodes, then 10,000 nodes have to relay that 144 MB of data, which is approximately 1.6 TB of data every single day. So the Bitcoin network usurps bandwidth worth 1.6 TB every single day minimum. This is the data that I have of approximately 2 years ago. It might have been increased exponentially by now, but on an average, let's assume that the Bitcoin network gossips only block information worth 2 TB every single day. As that information increases, the latency also increases, right? Because the more data that you have to transmit, the more time it takes, right? So what do we do to reduce that latency and that bandwidth? Okay, so we know that every node has a mempool. Okay, every node has a mempool. So whenever your node sees a transaction, it validates the transaction, it puts it in its mempool. Okay, so your mempool might have whatever size. Like my mempool has a size of 300 MB, so my mempool can contain transactions up to 300 MB. Okay, and when a block is mined, there is a very high possibility that majority of the transactions in that block are already in your mempool, except if you deviated completely from the default policies. But if you are running, for instance, Bitcoin Core and you are sticking to the default policy, then there is a very high possibility that 99% of the transactions that are in a block that was mined just now are already in your mempool, right, are already in your mempool. Because if your mempool policies are the same as the mempool policies of the miner, then your mempool will look very similar to the mempool of the miner. And the miner will select transactions from his mempool. So when the miner selects transactions from his mempool and the miner mines a block, there is a very high possibility that 98 to 99% of the transactions which are already in the block are available in your mempool. Now you have validated those transactions and put them in the mempool. The miner has now found a block. The miner will then broadcast that block and the block will reach you. Now you have to validate that block, right? Because along with validating individual transactions, your node also has to validate blocks, individual blocks. So what your node has to do is that your node first has to validate each transaction before entering them in the mempool, right? Your node saw a transaction, validated that transaction, put it in the mempool. Your node saw second transaction, validated that transaction, put it in the mempool. Okay. Now your node saw a block. Your node has to again validate each and every transaction in that block, even though those transactions are already in your mempool. So this is a lot of redundant work. So your node has to validate the same transactions twice, once before putting them in your mempool. Second, when a miner finds a block and the miner broadcasts that block and the block reaches you, again, you validate each and every transaction in that block, even though 99% of the transactions are already in your mempool and you've already verified them. Okay. So this is like double work. This is redundant work. How do we get rid of this? Compact blocks get rid of this. What are compact blocks? Basically, when a node sees a block it does not relay the actual entire block to its peers. It relays a compact version of that block. What's the compact version? The header will be as it is. Okay. Now each transaction, basically a block contains of transactions, right? A Merkle tree of transactions, and each transaction in the block is represented by a TXID, which I'm assuming is around 32 bytes. What is done is that those TXIDs are replaced by short IDs, which are of 6 bytes. Okay, so instead of having a block full of TXIDs, you have a block full of short IDs. Okay, short IDs. So you change the format of the TXID and convert it into a 6 byte format, which is a short ID, and then you relay the block. So all the TXIDs in the block, you remove it, you convert it into short IDs of 6 bytes, and then you share that block. So the block becomes very compact. It is computed that a block which is of 1 MB can be reduced down to 20 KB. Okay, so a block with TXIDs, if it is 1 MB, if you replace the TXIDs with short IDs, that same block can be brought down to 20 KB. That is like I'm assuming 98% of data saving, at least more than 90% of data saving. All right, so you can reduce the size of a block by 90% by just replacing the TXIDs by these short IDs, and each short ID is of 6 bytes. Okay, so this is how you can save data, right? And what happens is that firstly, while relaying, because when you relay a block of 1 MB, that takes a lot of bandwidth, but now that you're relaying a block of 20 KB, it reduces the latency and the bandwidth that the network consumes. Now what do you do as the node? When you receive a compact block, you already have 98 to 99% of those transactions in a mempool. So you take a TXID from a mempool, you convert it into the short ID, and you match it with the block. You see if that short ID is available in the block. If it's available, then you put you substitute the short ID with the TXID. Okay, that's what you do. So you have received a compact block full of short IDs. You take transactions in your TXID, you convert it into short ID, and then you start comparing what short IDs in the block that you've received are already available in your mempool, and all those transactions which are already in your mempool, you just substitute the short IDs with the TXIDs. And just in case if you don't have any transactions, then you request the peer who sent you the compact block for that specific transaction individually. Okay, so your compact block peer shares you a compact block, okay, which has short IDs. You take the transactions in your mempool, you convert those transactions into short IDs, you match them with the short IDs in the block. 98 to 99% of the transactions will match if your node, if your mempool policies are the same as the mempool policies of the miner. 1 or 2% of transactions might be missing. You can ask for those transactions manually. Okay, so what this does is that this saves a lot of latency, because now you don't have to validate each and every transaction before forwarding the block. You just validate the header of the block and you forward it. That's it. Okay, and it also saves a lot of bandwidth, because now instead of sending a 1 MB block, you're just sending a 20 KB block. So how this happens? Let us see if the numbers I mentioned. Short IDs. Okay, short IDs. The length of the short ID and the size of the short ID is 6 bytes. Okay. So how does this happen? I wanted to go more into detail of this, but now it's already 8:52. So earlier what used to happen is this, okay? Node A sees a block, okay? Node A will send an inventory message to its peer, okay? Node B is its peer. So node A sees a block, node A validates that block. Now it sends a inventory message to its peer node B that, hey, I received a block, okay? And I'm sharing you information pertaining that block. Do you have this block or do you not have this block? If node B has this block, then node B will just inform node A that, hey, I have this block, I don't want this block. If it doesn't have this block, then it will send the get data message that, hey, the block that you received, I don't have that block. And then node A will share the block. This is like the pre-compact block version. With compact block, how does it happen? You can have two types of compact block peers, high bandwidth and low bandwidth. What happens in high bandwidth? Node B will send a send compact message, this message, send compact. Now, send compact message can have two values, Boolean, 1 or 0. If it has value 1, it means I want you to be my high bandwidth relay compact block. Okay. So if one node send compact message to another node, it means that, hey, I want you to be my compact block peer. If it has one value, it means, hey, I want you to be my high bandwidth compact block peer. If it has 0 value, it means, hey, I want you to be my low bandwidth compact block peer. What's the difference between the two? A high bandwidth compact block peer will find the block and immediately send the block to you. It will not seek your permission. Okay. You've told him that, hey, you are my high bandwidth compact block peer, high bandwidth. Okay. The moment you find a block, just send the compact block to me immediately. Okay, these are peers with whom you have like very high trust. You trust that they'll not cheat you. Okay, and these are the low bandwidth compact block peers. With them, you tell them, hey, I want you to be my compact block peer, but every time you find a block, you give me a knock knock message. If I ask you for data, only then give me the data. That's the primary difference. Okay, so your high bandwidth peer, the moment it finds a block, it'll send you the compact block. Okay, if you have 100% transactions in your mempool, cool. If you don't have transactions, if they are missing, then you will ask for those specific transactions. Okay, so let's say you have 99% transactions already in your mempool, but you have 1% transactions that are missing from the block. You will ask for those specific transactions, and then he'll give you those transactions. Here also with the low bandwidth, the same thing happens. But here what happens is that your node will ask for permission that, hey, I found a block. Here's the information put in the block. Do you want it? Then you say, yes, I want it. Then he'll give you the compact block. Okay. Then you'll see if the short IDs in the those compact blocks in that compact block correspond to the transactions that are already in your mempool. If they are already in the mempool, well enough. If they're not in a mempool, you will ask for those specific transactions that are missing, and they'll send you that specific transaction. So this is what compact blocks are. This is what they do. These are the kinds of compact block peers that you can have, and this is the difference between how your compact block peers will behave depending upon whether they are high bandwidth or they are low bandwidth. Okay. So the question asks a new block is being relayed from node A to B to C. Okay, so there are three nodes A, B, and C. A sees the block, relays it to B, and B relays it to C using BIP152. Okay, so A, B, and C, all three are peers, and they are compact block peers. Okay, so A sees a block and relays the compact block to B. B relays that compact block to C, which allows relaying a block after only validating its header proof of work. Okay, so how do you relay a compact block? You only validate the header. You don't validate the entire transaction. Okay, to save time, what do? You only validate the header. You see that there's adequate proof of work in the header. Then if the header is valid, you relay the block. You don't validate each and every transaction. You just validate the header. And if the header is valid, you relay the compact block. When node B receives the compact block, it's missing some transactions. Okay, just like now we mentioned that it is possible that you receive a compact block and it is missing some transactions. So node B can't reconstruct the block immediately. It has to request the missing transactions from node A. Before B has received the missing transactions, is it possible for it to announce the block to node C? The answer is no. We'll not go into the detail because we're running out of time. The answer is no. Okay. So if you receive a block from your compact block peer, okay, which does not have all transactions that are in a mempool. 99% of the transactions that are in that compact block are in a mempool, but let's say 1% are missing. Until and unless you do not gain access to that 1% missing transaction, you cannot further relay that compact block. You cannot further relay that compact block because you need to ensure that the Merkle root in the header of the block is valid. And how do you ensure that the Merkle root in the header of a block is valid until and unless you don't have all the transactions in the block? Only if you have all the transactions in the block can you verify that the Merkle root is valid. And once you verify that the Merkle root is valid, only then can you be sure that the header is valid. And once you're sure that the header is valid, only then can you relay the block. So the gist of the answer is B forwarding to C before having received all transactions means forwarding before validating the proof of work, which would open a DOS vector. Web 152 explicitly prescribes doing so. A node must not, this is BIP152, must not send a compact block message without having validated that the header probably properly commits to each transaction in the block and properly builds on top of the existing fully validated chain with a valid proof of work, either as a part of the current most work valid chain or building directly on top of it. Okay, so you cannot further relay a compact block until and unless you have all the transactions in that compact block. If you have some missing transactions, you will have to ask for those missing transactions. Once you have all those missing transactions, then you will have to validate that the header is valid. The header will be valid only if the Merkle root in the header commits to all the transactions in the root. And once you're sure that the header is valid, then you can further propagate the compact block. This is what the question is all about, and this is what it answers. So yeah, we talked about compact blocks. We talked about what do compact blocks do to reduce bandwidth latency. We talked about how they convert TXIDs into short IDs and reduce the size of a block from 1 MB to 20 KB. We talked about the types of compact block peers, high bandwidth and low bandwidth, and what's the difference between them. And we talked about how a compact block cannot be relayed until and unless its header is validated, and its header cannot be validated until and unless the validator has access to all the transactions in the block. And if there are some transactions missing, then he'll have to manually ask for those transactions and then validate the header and then relay it further. So I hope this question is comprehensively covered. If any questions pertaining compact blocks or what we just covered, kindly feel free to interrupt and ask questions. Okay. In the meantime, I'll open my VS Code. Okay. After we're done, by 9:10, we'll plan to wind up the session. After that, if anybody wants to stay back, they can stay back. And in 2 or 3 minutes, we can go through the code of compact blocks and maybe even the, what do you say, the checkpoints. We'll also talk about checkpoints. In Bitcoin Core, you basically have checkpoints. Okay. Initially, what used to happen is that when you spin up a node, okay, when you spin up your Bitcoin node, it establishes connections with some peers, right? And when it establishes connections with its peers, it asks those peers for blocks, right? Because when a block is spun up from scratch, it does not have the blockchain, okay? So it needs to sync with the active chain tip. So if I run a Bitcoin node today, I will have to validate each and every transaction and each and every block till I reach the active chain tip, which is whatever 800,000, whatever is the current block, okay? How do I do that? I obviously ask my peers for it. Okay. Now there might be honest peers, there might be dishonest peers, right? So what if somebody that I am connected with is sharing a false chain with me? Okay. If somebody is pulling off a DOS attack, if somebody just wants me to waste my time, waste my computational power, waste all my resources, okay, and they're sharing a false chain with me. My node does not know what's a false chain and what's a true chain, right? It just got in touch with the network. So there needs to be a mechanism in place for a new node that is syncing up to the active chain tip to know whether the chain that it is building on top of is a valid chain or it is a false chain, right? So an analogy that I can think of is that if you're traveling, okay, if you're traveling long distance, if you're traveling on a national highway, at certain intervals you have these boards, right? So if you're, let's say, going Gujarat to Mumbai, you will find those boards like Mumbai 500 kilometers. So you know you're on the right track. Then Mumbai 400 kilometers, you know you're on the right track. Then Mumbai 300 kilometers, 200 kilometers, 100 kilometers. So these signboards tell you that you are on the right path to reach your destination. Similarly, we had checkpoints in Bitcoin Core, okay, hard coded values where when a node was syncing up to the active chain tip, when the node was syncing up to the active chain tip, a node would get informed that, hey, you're on the right. Now, how did these they look like? Checkpoints. This is how the checkpoints look like. Okay, so this is hard coded data. Uh, the first checkpoint is this is the block height. Okay, you go to chainparams.cpp and Bitcoin Core source and chainparams.cpp and then search for checkpoints. Okay, so this is the first checkpoint. And this is the block height, block number 11111. And what is this? This is the header hash. This is the header hash. Okay, so if your node is sinking, and it reaches this height, and what will happen is that at this height, it will check the header hash. If the header hash does not match with this value, it will realize that I'm being fooled, I'm being deceived. My peer is sharing a false chain with me. Okay, and then it'll reach if the header hash matches, then it will keep syncing. Then this is the second checkpoint. Again, it'll check whether the header hash of block number this is the same that my peer is sharing. If it's the same, then it'll keep syncing. The second checkpoint, third, fourth, fifth, and this is the last checkpoint of 29500. I think this is 10 years ago, 8 years ago, I don't know, long time ago. Okay, so initially, this is how Bitcoin nodes that wanted to sync to the active chain tip, Bitcoin nodes when they were spun from scratch and they wanted to sync to the active chain tip. This is how they used to keep a track of. Okay, so if your peer is sharing the blockchain with you, you come to this block and you see, hey, I've reached 11111. But the header hash of the block that my peer has shared with me does not match with the hard coded value in Bitcoin Core. You know that you're being deceived, and you will not follow the lead of that peer anymore. Okay, so these were checkpoints to ensure at regular intervals that you are syncing to the right chain. Okay, but we don't use them anymore. So the questioner asked, why don't we get rid of them if we don't use them anymore? Okay, why don't we use them anymore? Now what we do is every single time a peer shares a block with us, we check whether that block comes from a chain that has a specific amount of proof of work. So every time Bitcoin Core releases a new client, 27, 28, 26, 25, whatever it is, there is a hard coded value which defines a specific proof of work. Okay, so any block that a peer shares with you should have minimum that amount of proof of work. It should come from a chain that has at least that amount of proof of work. Only then will you access that block. So you don't even have to reach till here. Earlier, what was happening is that we were reliant on checkpoints. So until and unless you don't reach this height, you will not know whether your peer is fooling you or no. Now, what do we know? The Genesis block is hard coded in the Bitcoin Core client. The first block, block number two, when a peer shares block number two with you, you will check whether that block number two that the peer has shared with you comes from a chain which has a specific amount of work. That work, that difficulty is hard coded in Bitcoin Core. So if you're using Bitcoin Core 27, there is a specific amount of proof of work that is encoded. Let's say Bitcoin Core 27 was released on January 2024. So at January 2024, what was the amount of proof of work that was done to mine, let's say 800,000 blocks? That amount of proof of work will be hard coded in Bitcoin Core 27.0. So the moment a peer shares a block with you, you don't even have to wait to reach this height. Even before that, the first block that a peer shares with you will immediately check whether this block is coming from a chain that has that amount of proof of work which is specified in Bitcoin Core 27.0. If it is not coming from that chain, then you will reject that block. And if it is coming from a chain that at least has that much amount of proof of work which is hard coded in Bitcoin Core's client, only then will you accept it. So now you don't have to wait. Earlier you had to wait till 11111 to get to know whether you're on the right chain or not, and you relied on header hashes. Now you don't do that. Now the first block that you receive, you immediately check whether it's coming from a chain which has adequate proof of work. If it is, then you know that the chain is valid and the header is valid. So now we don't rely on checkpoints. That is what the question is about. What is the question? Where is the question? Okay, I did not open the question. We just go through the question in 3 to 4 minutes, and by 9:15 we'll wrap up the session. Okay, so by now we know what checkpoints are. Where can we find them in Bitcoin Core? In chain params.cpp. I also wanted to show you all how do we identify whether a peer is a compact block peer or it's not a compact block peer, but the computer is acting strange and also we run out of time. Uh, yes, so you have checkpoint data. So the questioner says, I have a few questions on checkpoint data. This variable seems stopped being updated for approximately 10 years ago. Okay, so the value we saw the last checkpoint was block number 295 double triple zero. That's like 295,000, and currently we're at 800,000 plus. So the last checkpoint was 10 years ago. So the questioner says we stopped using them 10 years ago, judging by the timestamp of the height of the most recent checkpoint. Also, I noticed that this variable is only used in contextual check block header function in source validation.cpp. All right. By navigating through multiple posts, I realized that the role of checkpoint data has been significantly reduced. Some Bitcoin code developers even mention that it is likely to be removed at some time, right? Because just now I mentioned we don't rely on checkpoints anymore. We rely on the proof of work of the blockchain that the peer is sharing our headers from. Okay, that's why since the past 10 years, the checkpoints have not been updated, and some developers are of the opinion that we can get rid of that code because we're not relying on checkpoints anymore. So my question is, isn't it already safe to completely remove the code related to checkpoint data? The possibility of Bitcoin being reversed to its 2014 state is almost close to zero. So it's almost impossible that somebody might pull a 51% attack and take the blockchain back to 2014, where we will need the checkpoints again, right? That is like very infeasible now. Or is there a chance that some new checkpoint blocks will be added in future? What does the answer say? After the headers download algorithm was improved in Bitcoin Core version 24.0.1, there aren't any known attack vectors that would require the checkpoints to be kept around. So the answer is there's no reason, there's no technical reason for the checkpoints to be kept around. There is the possibility of removing the existing ones, but so far that hasn't happened yet. I'd say the main question is how confident everyone is that there aren't any unknown attack vectors no one has thought of that the existing checkpoints might be protecting us from. Nobody can see the future, but given all that, I think that it is very unlikely that new checkpoints will be added. So the answer is that currently there are no technical reasons, there are no attack vectors that require checkpoint data to be present, right? It is highly infeasible that somebody will be able to revert the blockchain back to 10 years. The largest reorg we have had in the history of Bitcoin is 4 blocks. So, I mean, 5 block has never happened. A 5 block reorg has never happened in Bitcoin, let alone a 600,000 block reorg. So it's infeasible that somebody will unroll the chain back to 600,000 blocks and redo all the proof of work, and now we again have to rely on checkpoints. That's not possible. So the answer says that yes, technically there's no rational reason that meets the eye for checkpoints to exist even today. But you never know. Like nobody can be sure that there's no unknown attack, right? What's the known attack? Why do we need checkpoints? A known attack is that somebody could rewind the blockchain by 10 years. That's a known attack. And we believe that is infeasible. The amount of computation power and the work that will require is exponential. So we believe Bitcoin is now safe and quote unquote immune, or at least it is infeasible for somebody to roll back the chain by 10 years. Okay, so we are immune to known attacks. But what if there are some unknown attacks? What if there is some way in which a malicious peer can deceive another peer on the network into following the wrong blockchain which the developers are not aware of? Okay, so there might be some unknown attack that we're not aware of, and that could be the reason that the developers have chosen not to get rid of checkpoint data. Okay, so the question asks about checkpoint data. Why do we have checkpoint data now that we're not relying on them anymore? Now that we rely on this new parameter, is it mentioned here? Is it mentioned here? It's not mentioned here. Yeah, there's a new parameter, okay, on which we rely. I think it's check proof of work or something like that. I don't remember. Okay, so but there's something new that we rely on. We check on the proof of work of the chain from which the block is coming. Okay, so the answer is that yes, there's no technical or rational reason that meets the eye that we should still have checkpoints in Bitcoin Core because they've not been updated for 10 years and there's no technical reason for them to be there. But what if there are some unknown attack vectors? You never know. Somebody might exploit an unknown attack vector. Maybe that's the reason why the developers have just chosen to let it be there in the future. But you never know; they might remove it in the future. So that is what we had to cover in this session. We covered one, a mail from the Bitcoin Dev mailing list, and we covered 3 questions from the Bitcoin Stack Exchange, a Q&A. But we tried covering a lot of things. We covered the time warp attack and how it can be mitigated on the mainnet. We talked about compact blocks. We talked about transaction malleability and how SegWit fixes it. We talked about BIP62. We talked about PR6769. We talked about what checkpoints are. Do we need them anymore? What is the new mechanism on which nodes rely to ensure that they are syncing with the right chain now that checkpoints are redundant? So we covered a lot of topics. If anybody else wants, then in their free time, they can go through the other questions or the code and documentation changes. And if they have any questions, anything to share or ask, then they can post in the general thread. And apologies for the technical glitches that I went through. I'll have to delete that software, I think, from my laptop to ensure it functions properly. So as the session is over from my end, if any questions, please feel free to ask. If no, then you are free to leave.